Hello, welcome to the University of Brighton podcast. I'm Richard Newman. This is the fortnightly podcast which gets to the heart of things which matter to you, the students. And every now and again, we chat in depth with some of the academic and research staff as well to talk about the amazing work going on at the university. Now, in this episode, we're not going to beat around the bush here. It's been a really tough year for all of us, and some will be impacted more than others. We've had the amazing work of the NHS and frontline workers, many of which are studying here and alumni as well. But if you are a student, it's so important to talk and look after your well-being while things are so uncertain. And crucially, make sure you're aware of what the university is doing to support you and how to access that. So I'm joined in this pod by Patt Wrangles, the Head of Student Wellbeing. Thank you for joining me, Pat. We're 10 months on from the first lockdown in the UK. It's been a long time. How are you finding everything? And what do you do to make time for yourself?
That's a really good question. I think that kind of feeds into the questions that everybody's asking themselves around time. And one of the things I was going to touch upon really was about the fact that everybody is impacted by the pandemic and that everybody has their own sets of unique circumstances. So everyone's impact is kind of shaped by their own circumstances. So it's incredibly difficult for some people. There's all kinds of additional worries, work kind of blends in a bit with home life. So there's lots of challenges and trying to find time is really difficult, perhaps even more difficult, but equally vitally important. I think people are, when you think about mental health and well-being and managing your mental health and, trying to enhance your well-being, some of the key tools that we would use for doing that, such as, our support networks, such as doing things that we like, such as planning for the future, all of those things have been limited or restricted. So it does make it even more challenging, I think, for us to kind of find that balance and to be able to manage it.
I want to have a general discussion about what the university is doing to support students, the actual services on offer, but also just the conversations that some of you have been having with students as well. Everyone, as we have said, basically will deal with this pandemic in a different way. Clearly, there's no right and wrong. When you're hearing from students, what sort of things are they telling you? What sort of things concern you?
Well, I think one of the things that worries me a little is that we have significant support service in place, and we're delighted that we've been able to respond really quickly to the pandemic and kind of move that support service online very, very quickly so that we can still offer all of the support that we had. But I'm very mindful that not all students are local, and students will be kind of spread out across the country and some overseas. And I think that probably makes it more challenging for students, or that perhaps the university isn't their first thought in terms of support when they're not actually local in Brighton. So what we've done is to try to really communicate that to students, that no matter where you are in the country, you don't have to be local to access our support services. We're here for all of our students and we really can help. So I think it's really important to highlight that. The students that we are talking to, they're talking about similar issues to the general public. People are all impacted in different ways. There's obviously a concern about accessing study, whether students are able to be their best and achieve what they would have achieved if it wasn't the pandemic. And I think the university is doing as much as they can to both recognise that, around regulations and exams, but also offering support, offering care, listening to students and trying to respond. But as I said, it is a difficult case, a difficult scenario. We know that there's been a surge in some really tricky issues, online harassment, domestic violence. That's a global surge, a national surge, that's happening everywhere. So clearly that some of our community will be impacted by those things. Loneliness and isolation were always going to be issues for students anyway. Some students are coming to university for the first time, which we already know is a challenge, but they're now doing that in a very, very strange, uncertain environment, which just exacerbates the challenges that they had anyway. We all know that people like people generally, and often students will go to other students first, talk about challenges. There's less interaction there's less opportunity for students to do that. So it is, again, really important for us to continue offering our support, continue the proactive work we do for our Res Life team, for example. They've still got a community activities program, albeit, it has to ebb and flow with the government guidance around whether we can or can't contact students, have face-to-face contact students. But it's really important that those things are still available and the students are aware of them. So we are working as hard as we can to make sure students do access our services, whether it be reactively because they need some support or they're a bit worried, or whether it's just something, just an opportunity to engage with other students and keep up that kind of interaction.
And I guess it's difficult, isn't it? Because the only way you can really talk to students at the moment is virtually. It's well, if you're going to chat to them face to face, that's going to have to be pre-arranged. And then the only other way really we're talking about is emails and the social media and things like this podcast. But I mean, that's the only way you can get in touch. There's so much stuff that comes through. It's really about making sure the students know how to access that support online.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I touched on that earlier. I mean, we've obviously, from our support services, we've kind of really worked on our visibility online. So, we've developed animations, we've developed videos to try to encourage students to engage with us and to make it very clear that our services are still available. I mean, it is positive. There are positives, strangely, to the pandemic. Our students have adapted incredibly well to engaging with us on MS Teams or virtually, because it's not an easy thing to do. Sometimes accessing support face to face is a challenge for people. It's often a significant barrier that people have to kind of get over before they do that. But students have done really well, accessing their studies, but also actually accessing our services and speaking to our team. Despite the challenges, people don't have the opportunity to come in, so perhaps they haven't got space at home that they can talk confidentially in. Perhaps they're in a university halls or a flat, and again, they don't have that quiet space where they can do that, or they can take time to reflect. But students are very resourceful generally. They're finding ways to do that. We've done everything we can to kind of provide confidential spaces on site when students were accessing our campuses. But again, it's really difficult. But like I say, we're incredibly impressed. And we know that a lot of our students have overcome all kinds of adversity just to get to university. They will continue to do that throughout their studies, and they will continue to meet the challenges. But we are there to help. We are there to try to help students, succeed in whatever success looks like to them, and we will continue to do that. But it is challenging because it is all about virtual, and it does lose that human touch slightly. But I'm really lucky to have a super team who are very experienced in supporting students, both face to face, but also remotely, and they'll continue to evolve and learn the best ways to do that. There's lots of simple things that we can do as students, lots of simple tips and things we can do to help. Our disability team, for example, we've got learning support plans for lots of students. We can adapt those plans to suit the new environment. We'd encourage students to get in touch. I think the key message really is for students that if you are struggling, do get in touch and ask. There's quite a lot available still, and we are there to help them. And more often than not, we certainly can make a difference.
Yeah, all students will find things tricky, but I guess especially just touching for now on first year students, I guess, who will, who still haven't had those freedoms that you usually would have at the start of your university journey. And so, coming in during, well, we weren't in a lockdown when the university year started, but quite soon after we were, there must be such a rapid change of emotions. Again, the people that are in halls, they might never have lived away from home before. It's a bit of a up and down, isn't it, for students to deal with? And a lot of those people are very young people as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a huge shock when you first go to university. It's a real significant change in environment. There's suddenly all kinds of things that you need to be able to manage. I mean, some people adapt incredibly well, some take longer, but you've got to manage your finances, your bills, relationships with people you live with, cooking. There's a whole range of things that students need to take on board. And on top of that, their studies. And on top of that, living with strangers, trying to make friends, trying to fit in, trying to find your place. And that takes some time. We have a lot of support available to try and aid students and help them to do that. But it does take time. There's lots of things like sports clubs and societies that students can join that help them to do that. But again, restricted now because of the pandemic. We often see students that are perhaps in a flat where they just don't get on with who they live with, or they have different, philosophies around study. Some might want to party, some might want to really study and go to bed early. And those challenges are all, again, kind of magnified and exacerbated in this environment, because essentially you're put into that small bubble and that's what you're stuck with. So you have to find ways to integrate and to kind of get on with people. And it just becomes even more intense. So it really does, it really can feel like a melting pot, I think, for students. And that's why we're still there. We're still keen to work with our students, but a really challenging time, I think, for students to come to university. And we often see students with challenges around loneliness and isolation, fitting in, and that's, again, made worse here. You talk about emotions, people's emotions, even my own emotions, will flip-flop. One minute you'll feel really positive and think, oh, I can spend time and help my family, but the next minute you feel hugely frustrated or sad because you can't see other members of the family. And it changes all the time. It's very difficult to control your emotions in such a tricky and complex environment, particularly when you can't see the end. There's things that we can do in the future, like if you're struggling, you can look forward to something. This pandemic is really, really kind of strangling that. You can't, there's very little that you can plan in the future to look forward to at the moment, because there's so much uncertainty. So I think
how can we realign that, though? Because that's a key thing, isn't it? Really, that's one of the trickiest things, is trying to find something to look forward to. But maybe if you can set yourself small goals, maybe that's next week or maybe at the end of the week. Is that the way to go for now?
Yeah, I think so. I think, and it's being kind to yourself, really. Setting goals is fine, and lots of people want to do that. But equally, it's about giving yourself time and not putting too much pressure on yourself. There are things that you can plan loosely. There are things that you can make sure that you set. You reach out to family members that you haven't spoken to for a while. There are things that you can do, and I think everyone will have their own. But it's really just about taking some time thinking to yourself about what you can do to make yourself feel better. Who is it that you like to speak to? Who do you feel better, after you've spoken to, and those sorts of things. So there are smaller things that you can do, but yeah, hugely challenging. I mean, one of the other issues you have around halls is, there's very strict regulations at the moment about what you can do and what you can't do. And I think when you come to university, you have a set of expectations around meeting new people and going out, and then if other students are perhaps doing that, there's probably a bit of a peer pressure to get involved when perhaps that's not the guidance. So there's lots of other challenges that you need to manage, and that's a real, if you're living with a group of people that make a decision to have a party, you're really stuck, and all these things just add, I think, to the anxiety of coming to university.
Yeah, it's kind of everyone's issues there, like around the world, really, but amplified, isn't it, when you're just in that small halls space, because you can see everything that's going on, whereas for us, maybe living in separate homes, you just know that people might be breaking the rules. You can see it all the time. It really does put people under pressure, I guess. On the other side, a lot of our students, because it's lockdown, have not come back to the university yet, to come back to Brighton or Eastbourne, because we're in lockdown. So they haven't come back since Christmas yet. They're waiting for that time to come back, and no doubt they can't wait to get back as well. Some will be in rented accommodation as well across Brighton and Eastbourne. Both of those things comes with its own issues. How important then is it to make sure you have a good support network around you? Because the intensity of being around the same people all the time can also get to you sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I touched on this right at the start. I mean, your support network is absolutely vital, I think, to all of us. And even if that support network, like you say, you typically live with your family or friends, not everybody, but a huge amount of us. but that can become very intense, if that's the only people you're seeing. And that's so important to try to make sure you can maintain some level of normality or contact with people outside of that group, albeit virtually, or even, exercising within the government guidance, finding a way to make sure you can kind of break that intensity of just living in that same position all the time. Students, like you say, students may have been looking forward to coming to university for a whole host of different reasons. There's freedom, there's lots of opportunity there, and suddenly they're at university, but they're still at home, or wherever they were before they came in, and not really knowing when they're going to arrive. The uncertainties is probably one of the key challenges. Like I said, with not being able to plan and just not knowing what the future holds is really quite daunting for people. But as I said, it's something that we're all experiencing, which is why, the scope of the pandemic is hugely challenging, because everybody's impacted. So even, you can take some comfort from that. People often find that if they're not in it alone, it sometimes helps, but equally, the people that you might look to for support may also be struggling and looking for support. So there's, again, it really does create a fairly chaotic environment for you to, do the things that you would usually do to keep yourself well. So again, it's taking the time, looking after yourself, being kind to yourself, and just being fair and not setting unrealistic goals. Just trying to take each day as you can. I was speaking to someone recently, and they were talking to me about how they'd taken on a huge life challenge, and if they'd thought about the whole scale of the challenge, they probably would never have done it or got through it. But they spoke to me how important it was to just take a day at a time and stop that, that grand thinking about how am I going to do this for a year or 2 years or a month or whatever it is, and just think today's today. I'm going to get through today, and then we'll deal with tomorrow. And that, I really, it sounds pretty obvious and basic, but actually, if you can really start to think like that, I think it really makes a difference. It can really help. Just taking things in bite-sized chunks and dealing with what comes up each day is certainly helpful for a lot of people.
Sure. When it comes to working remotely, obviously it has its merits, actually, when you can attach flexibility to it in a normal situation, flexibility that the pandemic doesn't offer. But from a learning point of view now, how can students make sure they have a structure to their day to separate home from work, essentially? Because it's one of those conversations that we've talked about quite a lot since lockdown one. We've all had to get used to it. I've only just literally set up a home office 10 months into the pandemic after saying I would do it over and over again, rather than working at a kitchen table. And the difference is quite big. Just be able to separate, partition off a place in a room where you're like, that's my office. How important is it that you do that you have your working space, that you separate it from the rest of your life?
That's a great question. I think if I had the answer to that, it would be a very sought after answer. I think there are, some of us have got great opportunities to do that. I'm really fortunate. I've got a separate office which is detached from the house, for example, but there'll be lots of people that just simply don't have that opportunity or anything close to that. We speak about undergraduate students and students coming to university for the first time, but hugely important to think about the impact on our more mature students who are potentially juggling childcare, could well be suffering real anxiety around, job security in the future. The environment's really tough, so they'll be worrying about their financial position, worrying about their children, and actually, is their study going to be up there? It's going to kind of deprioritize that study. So whether they can even continue is a question. Even if you do have the ability to section some time off or section a place off in your house or your home, it's not always possible to always be there. So really, really challenging. And I think that there are solutions. There's lots of different things that people can do. We see colleagues working with headphones and partners, sharing a table and so on. And I think it really comes down to looking at your own individual circumstances, but really giving time to think about what you could do. Try to think creatively, think about what suits you. Some people might be quite content, laying on their bed and working, whereas others need to be sectioned off in an office. So you've got to think about what your needs might be, and just try to be as creative as you can. Try to give yourself that space. But like I said, there's no real answer to that, because my circumstances are really fortunate in terms of having the physical environment. But again, the other challenges come into that, so it doesn't always work. So I think people really need to just take the time to try to think about how they can be most comfortable in the environment they've got.
Yeah, I'd say just from my own personal point of view, I'm currently in a room which is essentially a spare room, which has a tiny desk in the corner, and basically it's the same size as what a hall's room would be, and got a tiny space just in the corner. And it's just, what worked for me is simply just to make something pretty to look at, whether it's a succulent on a desk or just a little bit of paint, tiny things, just your little corner of your room, which just sort of focuses your mind. That just, it's just strange how something like that can just make such a massive difference. You mentioned about, I wanted to come onto this a bit more in detail, actually, about that lots of our students won't be that what external audience might look at as a stereotypical university age. Many are more mature students, lots study part-time, they have jobs, children to look after, to homeschool at the moment, caring responsibilities for other members of their family. The pressure really could be building right now for those people. Clearly it's really tricky, but how do you sort of find that resilience to keep going? And if you are struggling too much, then who should you be talking to?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of who to speak to, our SSGTs are a really wonderful first point of contact, because they have a great understanding of the courses that they support, both the academic side, but also some of the more personal or issues that people might experience. So SSGTs are always a good point, for postgraduate students, their supervisor might be able to help. But all of our support services are available to all students, and I think that's really important to get across in this message. I think any of our teams can help, whether you're a new student for the first time at 18, or whether you're doing a PGR and you've got kids and work worries. We're not going to be able to solve people's issues, but we can certainly help. There are options. People can think about taking periods away from study. That we're looking at our academic team. I won't go into any detail because it's not my area of expertise, but are really considering how we can mitigate the impact or some of these impacts on people's study and ability to study. And I think the university generally, I know the university generally really care about all of our students and really recognise the whole range of different circumstances. So as I said before, do reach out and get in touch. There's lots of things that we can do to help support students. There is flexibility. The key thing for us is to enable our students to achieve, and achieve at their best. So we will do what we can to help. As I said, SSGTs are always a good route into support services, or to learn more about the different options they may have in terms of studying. So I would definitely encourage people to get in touch and reach out.
Yeah. In terms of external support as well, the university does a lot to support the students, but again, how important is it that students who've relocated and haven't registered with their GP do so? How easy is it to do that? And even if you do have one, to speak to them if you feel like you need to, because that's another issue that a lot of us have at the moment, isn't it? The news is always about the NHS being overwhelmed, but if you need to speak to someone about your own health, you need to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there's a really clear message there around making sure that you do register with your GP and that you are in contact with your GP as well. I mean, university support services are broad and we'll do everything we can, but we do also work very, very closely with our external agencies and organisations. Primary and secondary healthcare, really, really important. People have a whole range of different issues, some really complex, where they are going to need to engage that support. Now, we can obviously help that. We can work out, referral routes and so on with students. But the key thing is to encourage all students, as I say, to register with GPs. We did have two on-site GPs, and they will return to site when things kind of settle. But we do still work very, very closely with our two GPs. That it's very easy to register online. That they will have online appointments and they can make those available, as you'd expect with most of our GPs. So we would really encourage students to still make sure they do that. Don't wait until you need a GP to register, I think is the key message. It's much better to do that while you're feeling kind of fit and well, and then that whole hurdle's out the way and you can get access really quickly. So although it might feel like a strange time to be registering with a GP when you can't actually go into a GP, it's just as important, if not now more than ever, to be honest. So we would really encourage students to do that. And there are challenges. I don't mind, I'll be honest, we all see the news. There's an impact on the NHS. That means that our, local support services are restricted, but our team do work really closely with our support services, so they will know where might be better to get the right support. So again, even if you are seeking expert support or specialist support, then do come to us and we can still help you navigate perhaps the best route into that.
Finally, Pat, what would be your final words of advice then for anyone who may need support?
I think for students, and I've said this many times, I think the key thing is to definitely ask, is to reach out and ask. You might feel like you're trapped. You might feel like, there's no way out or there's nothing we can do to help. But as I said, that, we have got a whole range of services. We've got some really experienced professionals. We've got links to external services. We will know what flexibility there is with your study. So please don't just make decisions without asking. Just ask for help. Like I say, the second part of that is just be kind to yourself. Some of us will continue no matter what, and that serves you really well until it doesn't. There has to be a time. There is sometimes a breaking point. There is sometimes a time where you really need to reflect. So do be kind to yourself. Do think about yourself and reflect and take the time. And if you're struggling, or even if you're worried or you just want to chat, do reach out. Our support services are all still available, and we will happily help wherever we can.
Pat, thanks so much for your time for coming on the podcast. That's it for this episode. If you've been affected by anything we've talked about, please do speak to your SSGT, our wellbeing team, your GP family, friends. The university is here for you. We've talked about a lot of things in this podcast. Go to brighton.ac.uk/wellbeing to find out a little bit more. That's it for this episode. Take care and thanks for listening.